Trevor, can you hear me or everybody?
I can hear you, Eugene.
Ah, okay. I thought my microphone wasn't working. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you and welcome everybody for the SSG Management Webcast on focusing on COVID-19 impact and implication on Africa. We thought to be able to provide the right insight. At the moment, there's so many information out there and there's a huge confusion in terms of the current state on the economies and the African market in regards to the COVID-19. And we thought we pulled together experts to discuss some of the latest updates, implication, and hopefully we can also be able to provide some guidance and practical tips to our global audience who's currently listening. We are live on Zoom and the Facebook and the Twitter. So please share as much as you can, and hopefully by the end of the discussion, we'll be able to provide some guidance to businesses and the professionals who are either operating in the African market on the current state. So in terms of, before I kick off, in terms of housekeeping, I'll be muting everyone to minimize the disruption. And also we'll be taking the question at the end of the discussion. So we have 60 minutes to get some perspective and hear from our speakers in terms of their current state, their thoughts. And also after the discussion, we have 20 minutes to try and answer some of the questions we've received so far. And anybody who is currently live listening, if you have any question, please post it and we'll be able to go through some of the questions and trying to answer as much as possible. So to kick off the discussion, let me just share my screen. Okay, if you bear me,
Okay.
So to kick off the discussion today in terms of, we already know, I'm sure you can see my screen. Well, we already seen some of the major headline and the announcements across the globe in terms of the impact of COVID-19, which I'm not going to go through some of it in terms of the disruption in the market and of course, the COVID-19 is a human tragedy affecting millions of people, and our thoughts is to everyone who's been affected across the globe, and I hope everyone on this meeting are safe and well, and we wish everyone the best. And of course, we've seen quite a lot of major implication in terms of the disruption on businesses, livelihoods across the globe. Today, we want also to focus on Africa to understand what are the implications in terms of how the government are responding, or what are the action that they are taking, and how they're impacting business as usual, and how do we see likely to impact on the economy in the coming months and weeks, and of course years. There's so many speculation in terms of African economy going to recession for the first time in 25 years. We're seeing a lot of response from the government in absence of major fiscal stimulus packages and things like that. Of course, there's some prediction in terms of how far the African economy GDPs are going to fall. So without going too much into detail, probably our speaker will help us to shed some light in terms of what's the current state, what's the reality on the ground in their businesses or within their industry, and helped us to understand. So these are some of the questions hopefully we will aim to answer. But before we deep dive into the discussion and answer some of these questions, I just want to welcome our speakers on the panel today. So probably I just give them a few minutes to introduce themselves, give an overview in terms of their background, and also help to understand how the current situation has impacted their business as usual, and what's their world in terms of how are they responding to some of the disruption and things like that. So probably I'll go on the line, start with Andrew. Andrew, if you can probably introduce yourself and also give an overview in terms of how the situation is impacting the professional services and the situation in Nigeria and West Africa.
How should I answer? Am I not answering now?
Chief economist in PwC, West Africa, based in Lagos, been there more than a decade.
Hello, Andrew, we can't hear you.
Sorry, is this better? Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes,
the line is a bit.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
That's
speak closer to the mic.
Is this better?
Which denominations?
Is this better?
Pardon?
Can you hear me?
In Quancha or?
It's difficult to hear you.
Maybe let me just adjust my equipment and see if I can make it
louder, okay? We can't hear anything.
To Lydia, let me see if I can adjust my equipment. I thought we had the right sound.
Okay, thank you. I probably, while Andrew is adjusting, is adjusting his microphone, probably let me invite the next speaker, Lydia, to introduce herself and probably help us to understand what the current implication on the financial services and how she sees the situation evolving and some of the major trends disrupting the financial services. Lydia, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm the economist for the Nigerian bank FCMB. I'm based in London, and I cover the fixed income strategy for sub-Saharan Africa as well. So this situation is very complicated for all of us. Sub-Saharan Africa was supposed to grow this year, and we expected a lot of recovery, even in the financial markets. Now, I would say that when we look at the subcontinent, of course, we expect a recession. But I think according to each country's fundamentals, we will have a specific implication that we will talk about during this hour.
Okay. Thank you for that brief introduction, and hopefully we'll get to hear from you and some of the data and the running and some of the implication as we go along. Thirdly, let me invite Andia to also give a bit of introduction and also shed some light in terms of how the situation currently impacting the business as usual. Hi, Andia. Andia, can you hear us?
Sorry, I was on mute. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Andia Chakava. I'm the investment director at the Gresham Michelle Trust. I'm based in Kenya. My role there is primarily to drive gender-lens investing. We're a Pan-African organization that is really focused on the rights of women and children, really driving economic and social transformation. And we do this through our network across the continent. So I will be sharing two perspectives on this call, mainly on the observations that are happening within the Kenya environment, as well as the observations that we see how they are gendered, because this is not a gender neutral situation, and making sure that everybody really understands sometimes some of the impact that is happening to women in business. Being a gender lens investor, I primarily focus on supporting women in business and their impact on how this virus has affected a lot of the informal economy, as well as small and medium enterprises, which women comprise a large part of.
Thank you and welcome, Andy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you and welcome to the panel. The next speaker we have is Trevor. Trevor is our managing director for the Zambia and the US subsidiary that was launched last year, and is also an international economics, mainly focusing on the trade. Welcome, Trevor. If you can also give a bit of introduction and also help us to understand the current situation from your side.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, Eugene, and it's good to be on this panel. I'm Trevor Simumba. I come from Zambia, but I work across Africa as an international trade economist. I'm currently attached to the Ministry of Trade and Industry in the Gambia, and an EU project that is implemented and managed by DAI Europe. And so I'm a subcontractor to DAI Europe and attached to the Ministry of Trade in the Gambia. But currently I am back in Zambia because of this COVID crisis. We were asked to work remotely. So I continue to provide support to the government in the Gambia, but it's by virtual support. So emails, teleconference, Zoom meetings such as this one, and others. So for me, in my profession, I'm facing this COVID crisis quite directly. You know, it has impacted directly on my ability to provide support to the government of the Gambia. But thank goodness for social media, for technology that has enabled us to continue to provide support. Currently in Zambia, we have a partial lockdown. We don't have a full lockdown, such as what has happened in South Africa, Botswana, and a few other countries within the Southern Africa region. In the Gambia, they actually have a lockdown, but more importantly, they have also declared a state of emergency. And so a lot of restrictions on movement. Up to now, the border is closed. Flights are not coming in, flights are not going out. And for the Gambia, it's particularly a big impact because the Gambia depends, about 40% of its economy depends on tourism. And tourism that comes from Europe, you know, because Europe is only 5 hours away. And so the fact that they've closed off their borders means that a substantial chunk of their foreign exchange earnings have declined suddenly. However, they have been a beneficiary of the recent announcement by the IMF to provide relief to countries such as the Gambia. So countries like the Gambia, Sierra Leone, you know, Mozambique, and a few other what were known as poor and vulnerable African countries have received an immediate credit from the IMF, which I think will help. So yeah, well, I look forward to discussing more detail of some of the issues and how it impacts, particularly on the economic side, being an economist.
Thank you, Simumba, and welcome to the discussion. And if I go back to Andrew, Andrew, did you manage to connect? Are you able to hear us, bro?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you better now.
Okay. So as I was saying, I'm based in Nigeria. Obviously, we've all moved to working virtually. We've had a full lockdown for 2 weeks. I think it's fair to say that the financial sector and the business professional services have worked quite well. But the problem is, in fact, that not necessarily the government or other sort of sectors have the same connectivity. So, I mean, it's a challenging environment for us. We're into our second round of a 2-week lockdown that started 2 days ago in Nigeria. And as this webinar goes on, we can discuss more just the huge impact it's having on the bottom of the pyramid in all over the country.
Oh, welcome and thank you to join. It's glad to hear from you. Now we go to our next speaker, Nissan. Are you on the line?
Yes. Hi, Eugene. Can you hear me?
Yes. If you can introduce yourself, also give a bit of brief in terms of your work and how the situation has interrupted or disrupted your business as usual and how things are evolving at the moment.
Definitely. So thanks again for having me. My name is Nisan Abdulkader. I work for a company called WAFTech. We are an FDI specialized firm. So we work on behalf of government organizations across the world to attract greenfield and brownfield foreign direct investment. Obviously, I have been working in the continent. I head our Africa strategy and business development, as well as our partnerships on the continent. So we've been able to see really the impact on FDI globally, as well as on the continent itself. This has affected my work, but just to give you maybe sort of a macro lens on how it's affected FDI, we definitely see or predict a 15% drop in FDI. And around 18 to 20% in Africa. So really, I'm looking forward to having this discussion and shedding light on what this means. Obviously, we see a decrease in job creation, less or delayed investor interest, and a really big impact on certain sectors, especially countries which were heavy dependent on one sector, or perhaps limited in their scope of which markets they worked in. So I really look forward to having a more elaborate discussion on this, providing some insight on certain regional best practices on the response to COVID, both on a health perspective, but also economically in terms of which ones are best positioned to recover and some implications in that front. So I'm happy to be part of a very distinguished panel and very diverse and learn from you as well, and hopefully add value respectively.
Thank you, Nisan, and welcome. And we hope also to learn from you in terms of some of the implication and how things are evolving, and also share some insights and tips, especially to help our audience, to help them navigate the current situation also as they prepare for recovery. Finally, I have Nadia based in Senegal, and she's also work on the various aspects of mainly promoting investment into the African space. So Nadia, if you also probably introduce yourself and shed some light in terms of how the situation is disrupting your activity, and also shed some light in terms of how the situation is evolving.
Yes, so can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, okay, perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Eugene, and thanks a lot for all the co-panelists or co-speakers and all the participants. So basically, my name is Nadia Mrabit, and I'm half French, half Moroccan, so I'm half African. And we have actually, I'm a co-founder actually of an exclusive business club of senior professionals that are doing business in Africa. So our members are either based in any of the 54 African countries or abroad, but they all have in common to do business in Africa. So in terms of spectrum, we have actually members from all industries. So it's quite interesting now with the COVID to see, of course, thanks to our members, to have some really interesting insights on different sectors and the impacts, as well as depending on the countries, of what is actually what COVID is actually impacting on their daily business. So maybe also I will jump on what Trevor was saying before, because we have, for instance, I was thinking of one of our members who is the CEO of like a few hotels in the Gambia, and he's really deeply affected by all this because all his hotels are empty. All the Europeans, as you said, nobody's there, obviously, so has a dramatic impact. While on other sectors, for instance, we see some of our members are really, all of them are actually trying to find solutions and are really thinking of how to cope with the whole situation, and ensuring, for instance, of course, as Nisan was saying earlier, of jobs and also on livelihoods, as Andrew was saying also earlier. So I guess I'm really looking forward to this discussion, because I think that could be very interesting. And of course, on finding also some concrete actions that could be, done, or collaboration between different sectors, different people, different countries, to really help our continent to overcome this whole situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and everyone welcome to the panel. So we just deep dive into the first question, just to help us understand the implication and the impact of the response that currently has been implemented by the major government across the continent. So we're seeing the diversity of differing implication and also approach in terms of some of the action to respond to COVID-19. And of course, we've seen some government also taking some measures that quite a lot of businesses or peoples are not very comfortable, because majority of people believe some of those economies do not have the right infrastructure or the right systems or the cultural environment to cope with it. So Andrew, if you can shed some light in terms of the situation in Nigeria or West Africa, in terms of how the government is responding and what are the impact on the livelihood and of course the businesses in the region.
Thank you, Eugene. So, I mean, I think the government here is certainly trying and has been very proactive in Nigeria. So, there've been a number of programs announced, obviously to support the health sector with billions of naira of support and equipment. There have been small hospitals set up in Lagos very quickly, for example. In terms of fiscal support, I mean, one of the things the government recognized very early on was they needed to have fiscal injection happening into the country, and that's happened on a number of fronts, but of course not on the scale that you see in a place like the UK or the US. The problem we're having, though, is the lockdown effectively takes 50 to 70% of the wage earners who earn a daily wage and takes their income to zero. So what we've been saying from PwC is, look, there's two things that need to happen here. One is that there needs to be money that flows to the bottom of the pyramid, and the government needs to source it from wherever they can get it. So this includes the donors, the World Bank, the IMF, all of those programs. We should have no qualms here about tapping. The government's been doing that. But the issue is there a system to get it into the hands of the bottom of the pyramid? The other big challenge, of course, is the security of the food supply chain. And we've only been in this lockdown 2 weeks. It's not clear the food is getting to where it needs to be already. And the longer it goes on, we have problems coming into, is the next harvest going to be adequately done on that? And we've already had some security challenges certainly in the Lagos area, literally in 2 weeks into this. So I think it's going to become a more and more difficult situation. But the number one thing that we want the government to focus on, as I said, is getting money into the hands of the bottom of the pyramid and the security of the food supply. We've already talked to big companies in the food supply chain, and we have issues around the airport. We have issues around the port because there's still some parts that are imported. But we also have a lot of issues because there's a patchwork of different Nigerian states having different lockdown conditions. Moving goods, moving food from one part of the country to the other is actually quite difficult. And we need some national coordination to be able to prevent that. A longer term, I mean, this is obviously a wake-up call to the Nigerian economy. I mean, we have been discussing, we don't even project the GDP impact, but we've been putting out, let's call it a guess. If the World Bank is saying that the GDP in sub-Saharan Africa is going to shrink maybe 2 to 5% in 2020, we're an oil economy. The income from oil has effectively collapsed because oil is about the price, the cost to take it out of the ground, so there's no net revenue coming to the government. So we're saying that the economy here is going to shrink -5 to -10%. And of course, we still have a 3% growth rate of population. So, I mean, we're talking about a catastrophic reduction in income. And we need all the help we can get from around the world, from the diaspora, to kind of, in effect, just keep this place going. But it's a very worrying situation, particularly on the security side in Nigeria.
Quite a lot of things going on in Nigeria. Of course, we know Nigeria has been facing quite a lot of challenges over the years, and now coupled with the oil drop and issues, it kind of creates quite very complex challenges for the business and the livelihood. For Andia in Kenya, what's the situation and across East Africa, and what are the government responses and to countermeasure some of the impacts of the COVID-19?
Yeah, hi. So here in Kenya, we have a curfew. So basically, it's really from 7 to 7, and it does have a huge impact on what we call the should I say our hustler economy, which usually starts early enough so that they can buy their goods in the morning and go home late enough so that they can basically sell their goods and just make money from for their food and rent that they need. So we have a curfew. The government is quite hesitant to do a full lockdown just because of the impact that it would have on the people that benefit from day-to-day trading. And what the government has been toying with is different aspects of sort of food distribution. There is a national response fund that has been set up that the government is using to mobilize support. In addition to that, we've seen some very active participation from the private sector. Not only are they part of the National Response Fund, so we're talking about the telcos, bank CEOs, key sectors like manufacturing and hospitality. Of course, tourism is a very big component of our GDP. The horticulture industry has also been massively impacted simply because of those restrictions. But we're also finding the private sector on their own organizing their own initiatives and really coming out to say these are some of the things that we can do, which is really around distributing sort of water to particular areas and seeing if they can get the message out about social distancing, about sanitation. Right now in East Africa, we're leading at about over 200 cases. At Tanzania, and I speak not really on behalf of the government, but on behalf of my friends that are worried that, the government is still encouraging them to go to churches to pray against coronavirus. So when people are staying home, where here it is encouraged for people to work from home, employers are being encouraged to support the current status quo. Tanzania is sort of going on in a business as usual affair. Uganda, we saw some very strong, decisive moves. Uganda was one of the last within the region to basically declare that they have the virus, and they were also partly affected by Ebola. So we're expecting to continue to see a very robust response from Uganda, just from their past experience, and also that their Minister of Health is also a woman. So we also feel that there's going to be some very key issues that are going to be addressed when it comes to really looking at some of the gendered impact of the frontline workers, mainly being nurses, and really seeing how we can basically tamper some of the impact on the business community. We've seen the banking sector come up with support and encouragement from the central bank, really to offer some moratoriums to their clients, some waiving of fees that has taken place. But I think what is missing and what we're looking for is what is the environment? Is there a risk appetite really to lend? Because the businesses that we're seeing now, the kind of the support they need is to stay alive. It's survival support. It's not really the time to start talking about when are you going to be able to pay this loan back. So really looking for a lot of grant capital, which has predominantly been driven towards the government. I would like to say on overall, we've seen a boost in local innovation. Kenya, as you know, is known as Silicon Savannah. We are seeing that the technical universities, the students, coming up with local solutions in terms of even ventilators. So really relying on our own ability. I think most of my colleagues will also agree with me. Sometimes in Africa, we import too much. We have so much trade going in and out. And some of these things can be made locally, but because of dumping, the pricing doesn't allow it. So just seeing a bit of that. I guess for us, what has been a refresh has been also just the lack of politics. There was a lot of politics, a lot of politicking. The politicians have disappeared. There are new heroes coming out every day to talk what is happening with the local community. And I think what we're looking for, and I'm waiting to hear the outcome of it. The East African community heads were meeting today to coordinate a response so that the region is sort of working in harmony with one another on how they're going to sort of address the challenges that are being brought about through COVID. Yeah, so I'll stop there for now.
A global perspective, of course, looking at the sub-Saharan region and some of these responses we are seeing from Nigeria to Kenya to SA to Egypt, and what's the impact and how do you see likely to affect the FDI and the business as usual and also financial services?
Is that to me?
Lydia.
Oh, Lydia, okay.
Hi, Lydia.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear?
Yeah, can you repeat the question, please? I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was just asking if you give us an overview in terms of how you see the situation evolving and the impact on the global investors and businesses, especially taking the holistic view across the sub-Saharan region based on pinpointing some of these things just been mentioned from Nigeria to Kenya. What's the impact? How do you see from a financial point of view?
Yeah, so I think for SSA, the main concern remains the economic impact that suggests a massive slowdown in investment, commodity prices, trade, and tourism. And this is likely to plunge the subcontinent into a recession. In terms of implication and effects, I would put them in two categories. On one hand, we have endogenous implication that will lead to disruptions of economic activities. We have the decline in commodity prices and export receipts that will decrease the domestic demand and increase public expenditure. And we have these capital flights from FDIs or FPIs that will weaken the currency and increase domestic prices. Then on the other hand, I think we have exogenous effect that comes from affected partner continents such as Asia, Europe, and the United States. We have affected sector as tourism, and we have the decline in remittances from the African diaspora, the decline in FDIs and FPIs, as I mentioned, and that could push illicit financing flows up. So in terms of impact on the financial markets, of course, as a small market, given the current aversion for risk, investors are leaving the emerging and frontier markets, and this is likely to last and impact even more financial markets and the global economy of the subcontinent.
Give us an overview in terms of, sorry, I'm trying to adjust to the current situation at home and with new participants. So if I go to Trevor to give us an overview in terms of what's the implication on regional trade, and those, if you can tackle how is likely to affect on the cross-border trading and the Africa Free Trade Agreement in the near term and the long term?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, the endogenous factors that Lydia raised, she's very correct. We're already seeing it in the Zambian economy, where the kwacha has depreciated against all the major currencies by over 30–40% in the last 2 months. And this has precipitated higher pricing. You know, inflation has gone up, it's in double digit. And this is you can look across the whole region of sub-Saharan Africa, this is having an impact. So what COVID-19 has brought about in stark reality is the fact that Africa needs to enhance intra-Africa trade, because we are so dependent, all the sub-Saharan African countries are so dependent on primary export of products into the US, into Europe, into China. So for example, Zambia, as we are speaking now, the copper price has gone down because China is not buying as much copper as it was before, because China is the biggest market, single market for copper exports. All right, so we've seen a decline in the price. It's also fluctuating very quickly. There's a volatility, higher volatility. Most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are facing a debt crisis. A lot of these countries were already facing difficulties in servicing their debt, and now it's become even worse, because in order to finance a lot of the COVID interventions within countries, countries are having to increase their fiscal deficits because they're taking money from other priorities to putting it into the health sector. So really, the reality is that Africa needs to get its act together. We need to get the Africa Free Trade Agreement fully implemented as quickly as possible, because then this will reduce our vulnerability in terms of crises such as this. Secondly, we also need a regional approach. We need at the Africa Union level a very clear, coordinated approach that will ensure that as quickly as possible we can recover from this crisis. Because as Andrew pointed out, and this is the same across Africa, 70% of the economy has already been decimated, because a lot of the small-scale informal traders account for the bulk of employment. They account for the bulk of economic activity in all these economies. So for instance, South Africa has been on total lockdown. South Africa is a huge trader across Africa. All of us who live in Africa know about ShopRite, Pick and Pay. You know, all these big retail companies are all South African based. And now it has affected the supply chain, which has found itself affecting a lot of the industries. So for instance, in Zambia, one of our biggest mines has just closed down because of two major factors. Number one, they're not able to get their people, their technical people, to fly in, because most of the expatriates working on the mines, copper mines in Zambia and in the region generally, are coming from Australia, South Africa, Europe, the US. And so they're not able to get these workers back in because they're all in countries where there's lockdown and there's travel restrictions. Secondly, the mines are not able to get their spare parts, their necessary spare parts, as quickly as they should because of these restrictions on movement of goods and people. And so they've decided to put the mine on care and maintenance, which puts at risk 11,000 jobs on the mines, on the copper belt. Now, if we transpose this across Africa, the implications are huge. And so we need a clear, coordinated approach. We need the regional economic communities, such as ECOWAS, East African Community, Southern Africa Development Community, COMESA, the Maghreb region, to come together and develop a cohesive strategy and plan and be able to get that financed by multilateral donors. And I think it's very important that we should point this out. You know, the US government and all the European government, they shouldn't look at coronavirus as a national issue. This is a global pandemic. It's going to affect everyone. So it doesn't make sense for the US to be withdrawing financing to the World Health Organization, which puts at risk that countries that have so far been able to manage the pandemic with the help of the WHO suddenly will find themselves without resources, which means that by the time, because America and all these countries will not be able to close off travel forever. Travel will have to open at some time. So do they really want to have the risk of more of new cases coming in as a result of neglecting a global approach to solving this problem? I think nobody wants that. So I think it's very important that politics should be taken out of this. You know, countries should stop these sovereignty issues and let's work together and deal with the issue. The way the business community is working very well together to try and mitigate the issues that are arising from this coronavirus.
Thank you, Sumumba, for pointing out. Of course, this week we saw the nomination of African Union envoys to help and tackle the COVID issue across the region, and we are waiting to see their agenda and their priorities. And I'm sure probably they'll come up with a collective response for the whole region. And it's good to see the nomination from the African Union because they put a good team. But from Nadia, from your side, what's the situation and from the members you are working with from West African community, what's the situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're not working only on West Africa. We have really members from all across the continent. So it really depends, as said, on the country and also on the sector. So we have, for instance, as said earlier, like in the tourism sector, obviously it's really tragic. While, for instance, in other sector like the telecom industry, we have a director general of one of the biggest telecom operators in a West African country, and they're actually, even though they noticed, of course, a rise of voice and data usage at the beginning of the confinement. Actually, so it's in Burkina Faso. They see now that they have to actually find other solutions, because obviously there is a lot of pressure on the telecom network. It is also critical for them to face the decrease of purchasing power of their customer base. So as all the other co-speakers said, because of, as said, as 70 to 80% of the population is in the informal sector and are living on a daily basis. So the telecom sector in general, in terms of crisis, and especially with this global pandemic, is definitely, at first it looks rather good for them, but they really have to change a bit their model. They have to reinforce their network, which is critical, especially in countries where it's not only coronavirus that is hitting them, but they're hit by conflicts, by terrorism and stuff like that, where they're actually really facing dramatic issues to fix problems on their network. So all this type of issues, or like fiber optic lines that are cut somewhere because of different local issues. So that's for instance, for the telecom sector. We have another member, for instance, now I go to the other side of Africa, so to East Africa, in Rwanda, in a university. And over there, they've noticed, at least for their university and some other universities, they had started already to do a lot of online classes even before the COVID breakout. So for them, at least, they could manage to enable all their students to have a proper internet access and to go through it. And here also, with the help of some telco operators in different countries, be it, we've seen examples also in Ghana and South Africa and in Rwanda, that are helping all the education, really from primary education to university education, with actually free access or special packages to do those online education in, unfortunately, only in the places where it's accessible. Again, here, as Andrew and the other speakers were telling, the problem is most of the population does not have access to internet, does not have a smartphone, does not have a tablet or a laptop or whatsoever, so it's critical. Then also in the energy sector, it's also dramatic because including also, for instance, for all the off-grid and rural electrification efforts that were put forward lately. So we've seen also that in the off-grid sector, as said, so for solar PV producers and the ones that are doing those pay-as-you-go systems, here again, also they're facing critical issues because of the reduction of purchasing power of most of their customers. And of course, not willing to cut the electricity or the power there, because that would also have a dramatic issue. Then in terms of, if you go more into like, for instance, agriculture and food security, and I fully agree with what Andrew was saying earlier for Nigeria, but obviously this is really common to all African countries, is the food supply chain issue, and of course also the new agricultural season starting now in most countries in May and June. So the question is, how can farmers, and mainly smallholder farmers, because they represent at least 80% of the farms, how will they get access to agricultural inputs, meaning seeds, fertilizers, etc., while they're already facing, while they're already subsistence farmer most of the time, and all markets in the countries where the lockdown or curfew or state of emergency has been put in place, is definitely a critical problem. So so this is just for a few examples, but I must say, in a nutshell, a lot of our members, as said, are really focusing on finding solutions, on actually rethinking also their organization, but also their business model, their offering, be it products or services, and how to handle that. And we have also some, for instance, one member in Eastern Africa, where they are actually disrupting actually the retail and distribution in some countries like Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda, for instance. And here they've seen, even though, so they're focusing on small shops, like on small shopkeepers. And those guys, obviously, despite the lockdown, they're still in business, even though they're really scared of getting the coronavirus, obviously, because they're in touch with a lot of people coming to the shops. They actually, thanks to this members organization, they can have access online. They just order online and per SMS to get all the products they need, and they get it shipped right on time. So far, in terms of logistics for this type of, let's say, food supply chain, which is very particular, so far they don't have many issues, except they said a little now they're feeling it in Kenya, for instance, with their imports, but this might help to shift to more local products. So again, something to think about.
Thank you, Nadia. I'm just going to combine the next question with the next topic with a couple of questions. And the question is mainly looking at when do we see the peak? And also if we are saying that Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa is going into recession, when do we see this recession, and when do we come out of this recession? And to be honest, there's a bit of confusion in terms of recession in Sub-Saharan Africa, because sometimes the reliability of economic data we see from cash-based economy sometimes are not a reflection of the true picture on the ground. But it will be good to hear from the panelists in terms of when do you see the peak of the COVID-19. South Africa already saying September. I don't know from Nigeria, from Kenya, Zambia, what's your thought in terms of when do you see the peak and when do you see the recession coming and how long is it likely to be? Andrew, do you mind maybe start from Nigeria and share your perspective in how do you see, when do you see the peak and the
Thank you, Eugene. So let me start out by saying I think economists globally have done a very poor job for the beginning of this crisis, because even as late as mid-February, they were talking about global growth growing from 3.5 to 2% or 1.5%. I mean, it's obvious that if you have a lockdown, that the economy effectively collapses, right? And if you think about the Italian situation, we knew in February every hotel was insolvent, every airline globally is insolvent, everyone that serves the tourist industry, and then it just radiates out from there. And of course, I think really even as late as mid-March, I read one South African commentator saying the worst case was a contraction of the economy of 0.5%. So the issue of a recession, are we in a recession? We're already in a recession, right? The question is, are we in a depression? And I think that if you've seen some of the recent kind of numbers in the developed world, you realize just how serious this is. I mean, we've got 18 million people unemployed in the United States in the last 3 weeks. We've got the official body saying you might have a contraction as much as 35% in the second quarter in the UK. And of course, we're not immune to this in Africa. So I think we've put out a guess, as I said, I think earlier, of -5 to -10% contraction in the Nigerian economy in 2020. It might be worse than that, but we're just at the beginning of this. And of course, from a health viewpoint, the problem with this virus, I mean, none of us are experts, I don't think, on this call, but I mean, I think it's obvious to everyone that the potential is for multiple peaks, and that's being started to talk about in the press. So obviously, it's a global thing. If the entire globe shut down for 3 weeks, we might have it under containment. But when you open up again, it can come from somewhere else. So I think we're in for a long-term pain. I mean, the South African government, if I understand correctly, announced that they thought the peak would be in September. People are already talking about coming out of lockdown. Here in Nigeria, people are complaining that we've extended the lockdown another 2 weeks to 4 weeks in total. So I think the continent, and certainly Nigeria, faces an immense dilemma right now, because it's not possible to have the lockdown that we have in Lagos and Abuja and Ogun State at the moment go on for months and months. It's just a human catastrophe. On the other hand, it's not, COVID-19 is spreading almost every day to new states in Nigeria. So I have no idea how we kind of manage through this. I mean, I've had commentators, I've talked to epidemiologists that have suggested that Africa may have no choice, but in a sense to do what the UK thought it would do, which is let it run through the population from the viewpoint of building up a herd immunity. So I think what's been a surprise to me is how few cases have been reported in Africa. In Nigeria, we have about a little less than 400 reported cases. Is that because, and obviously everywhere around the world, the number of reported cases is less than the actual cases, but is it a gap of a small gap or is it a massive gap? And I don't think we know. So you have the feeling in Africa and Nigeria kind of waiting for a medical health catastrophe to happen day by day. But in terms of the economic impact, the reality is as painful as it's been so far, and it's been very painful even in these short weeks, I think we're only at the beginning. So I'm sorry I don't have any better news from Nigeria.
Well, thank you for pointing out. Of course, there's a few things we just mentioned. Of course, in the UK, of course, we're looking at contraction of 35%, and also there's been quite a lot of discussion in terms of the impact and implication. There's a mixed feeling in terms of the numbers that has been reported are only death like through the hospital, but they are not capturing the true impact because they are not doing countrywide testing. But to go to the next speaker, Lydia, what's your thought in terms of when do we see the peak, or when do you see this recession in Africa, or when is it likely to come out from your perspective?
Well, when we look at the numbers of cases and deaths, we understand that the crisis has not yet reached epic proportion on the continent. So this crisis is likely to last during the coming months. One thing that the governments should take into account is that the existing inequalities that we can see on the continent that include social distancing and the gaps in health system. So even if developed countries are starting to talk after the lockdown, I think the situation will last longer in Africa because of these inequalities. We can talk in terms of several months, but it can go until 2021. It's really difficult to give you a real number, but according to the current cases, and this, as I mentioned, I think proportion can grow in terms of on the continent for this crisis.
Thank you, Lydia. Of course, there's also concern in terms of the numbers, in terms of the measurement in Africa, how they respond, the healthcare responses. Some of it has been criticized because it looks like some government don't even have a clue in terms of the spread, and of course the testing also is not very robust, and quite a lot of government are still in the early phase trying to find out what is the situation. So it's quite worrying. And let me get some pictures from probably Andia. Andia, what's your thought in terms of the impact, and where do you see this recession? Is it a true recession, or what's your thought from East African perspective? And
yes, I think already we were sort of limping on in this particular environment. Kenya in particular, you know, I think our economic growth projection was a lot lower than what we have, you know, as Rwanda or Ethiopia. So we already had politics that was sort of hampering our own economy. So this is sort of like, so businesses generally was struggling. It was common to see like just businesses saying that there's no liquidity there. And a lot had to do with, we had this very big expensive project, SGR, I think you all know, the most expensive project in the world, infrastructure project in the world. So, I mean, I think the whole cost, the whole thing of debt forgiveness during this time, I think is a big deal for African countries as we look to combat what Corona is going to be within our particular environments. In terms of how it impacts, remember, the GDP growth is sort of, I would like, can I be controversial enough to say it's not very accurate because it doesn't really take into account the activities of the informal economy. And the informal economy are their day-to-day hustlers. And maybe they show up in the money transfer systems because quite a lot of money is moved there. And that's the real threat. And one of the big things that I've been advocating for, in order, you might have a recession where you say the businesses are slowing down, but what you're trying to avoid is a real sort of recession at the informal economy level, where that could lead to social unrest. And the social unrest will just be as a result because people don't have anything to eat and they don't have a roof over their head. It's a real life and death situation. So really trying to advocate for what can be done during this period to mitigate that. And to us, I mean, to me, it's more like, can we, and I think can we get cash transfers? Can we get money into the hands of those sort of informal economy, rather than, you know, sort of plead with people not to I would say like the middle class has always been, I would say, hiring people as domestic workers, or having drivers, or having people that they have in errands. And now people are scared to interact with people. So you may find somebody's income may not have changed because their company is still in a wait and see mode, but they're not really having their domestic worker come in every day. And if their domestic worker is not coming in every day, they're having a problem justifying why they should pay them. So it's more like empathetic. Just keep empathy, keep paying people as much as you can when you can. And also, how can we actually get some tangible income for those where the sector is overnight? Like tourism, Serena, one of the biggest hotels, just sent people away on unpaid leave. Just say, let's see you in June, mid-June. Let's see what happens in mid-June. I mean, we have these beautiful pictures of the animals roaming around freely in the Mara without a group of cars following them. But in the reality, there was a lot of people working in those particular industries who were, you know, making an honest living that aren't able to do that anymore. What happens to them? They weren't necessarily the same person that was trading over and over. So I think it will become even more than a recession. It will become a social unrest situation if we don't figure out how to just sustain it, and we don't do it just by food distributions, because food in itself can have power structures that can also reduce the dignity of the people that we're talking about. So can we get money in the hands of people and allow them to make choices, and allow the economies within, should I say, the informal settlements, within the cities, to just have their own sort of quiet way of interacting. So a lot has been said from a virtual businesses being able to go online, and that's true, but we have to bear in mind that being online and having data is a privilege. And not everybody has that access, not everybody has that ability. So yes, but not every, now when we have education, you say education online, the schools that were able to go online were already online, and most of those schools were international schools. They were not local schools. So the government went on radio and started broadcasting the curriculum on radio. So if you're a kid and they haven't even talked about exams, you're probably sitting there in some sort of there with another one trying to listen to the radio to revise. So, I mean, I think like Africa's gonna find its own solutions. I think Africa's really resilient. I know that people like, oh, well, Africa's a bit weak. I mean, it might be a catastrophe. I think what I've seen with COVID across the world, countries that I thought had the best medical systems are on their knees. There's going to be different heroes that are gonna come from this, and there's gonna be different stories, but we have to tell the story in the African way based on the African context.
That's quite interesting, especially you highlighted a few things. Social unrest, we've seen quite a lot of in the news, especially from South Africa, people going hungry and ransacking some shops, and also talking about getting money into the informal economy. I know Nigeria talked about giving some money, 20,000 naira to the population, but we haven't seen that money yet. So there's quite a lot of talks out there about action speak louder than words, and we wait to see some of this action being implemented. And also, you are right, you pinpoint the failure of some of the Western economy in terms of health system that has unearthed certain weaknesses in some of these healthcare system. And of course, we are all learning as we go along. And so from Zambia, I think let's hear from Smumba in terms of what's your perspective? How do you see, when is the peak in Zambia and across the region, and how do you see this recession, and what will be the implication, and when are we looking to recover in this recession that Tokyo? Is it a recession, or are we already into recession and we are just looking into depression, or what's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're already in recession. The government of Zambia, the Minister of Finance made a statement, I think about a week and a half ago. He's already reduced his GDP growth rate from 3% to less than 2%. He's hoping for 2%, but I don't think that will happen. I see zero growth for Zambia, and basically, depending on how quickly the government of Zambia obtains some credit support, in particular support from the IMF, we can avoid a depression. But we are in serious difficulty because, you know, for the whole region of Southern Africa, the importance of the South African economy is very critical across the whole of Southern Africa. And so when you see the peak of cases, the total lockdown that we're seeing in South Africa, the supply chains across the region are impacted greatly. The small traders who go to South Africa to buy certain commodities to come and resell in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, you know, in Botswana, all across the region, in Malawi, Angola, you know, Mozambique, they are now not able to do that. They're not able to cross the borders because there's a lockdown in South Africa. You know, we already have one of the biggest retailers, Educon, which owns Edgar's and Jet, has closed, not only here in Zambia, but in South Africa as well. So they're closing down across the board, you know, and that's a big loss because Edgar's and Jet are staples in malls, in shopping malls across the region. If you just walk around if you walk around the various supermarkets, just looking around, you'll see some parts of the shelves empty, you know, and in fact, the Zambian government last week had a meeting with the South African government, with the embassy here. Obviously, the officials didn't travel from South Africa, but a meeting was held with officials, and then they were connecting virtually with the government in South Africa, and they've had to make a deal on facilitating supply chains for the South African companies that are based here in Zambia and that are providing services here, that are providing retail services. So we are really, we shouldn't underestimate the impact of this crisis on the economies of Africa. We shouldn't, you know, and I think it's very important that we have a continent-wide strategy and approach, particularly when it comes to the recovery. Because at this moment, the focus, which is appropriate, is on making sure we do not allow this virus to spread. So right now, the focus is public health, to make sure the public is kept healthy and we're able to get back to at least some modicum of a normal life. The fact of the matter is there's going to be a lot of change across the board. Yesterday, I went for a haircut. You can see, you know, I've shaved after fearing going, but I thought, you know, I can't appear on this panel with a whole full beard. So I went for a haircut, and I was speaking to the barber shop, to the guy in the barber shop. The guy was cutting my hair, and I said to him, "How is business?" So he says, "Look, can I tell you that you are my first customer?" And this was like 3 p.m. in the afternoon. He says, "You are my first customer. It's a real struggle. We are just surviving just by the grace of God." And then he went on to tell me about the pressures he's having at home, because he looks after, which is the normal case in most African families. He looks after about 3-4 other siblings. One of his siblings, his job was every day going to the factories, various factories in Lusaka, to get what we call a piecework jobs. You know, this is daily jobs where they pay you, you know, 30 kwacha would be about, the dollar is, yeah, that's only about like $3-4, $5 basically, you know, per day, you know. And he said to me, right now, there is none of these kind of jobs. All daily workers are not getting any job. They're not being allowed to even line up at these factories. The only people who are working in the factories right now are the permanent employees, you know. So you can imagine how many young people have lost their income right now. And you know, you can imagine if you did a total lockdown. Right now, our minister of the province is going around the city whipping people for breaking the rules of social distancing and gathering, you know, because people are still gathering to have a drink, to have a beer. Because, you know, as you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of cultural issues, social cultural issues. So we really need to be very strategic and very clever and creative in how we can get money, as Andrew keeps saying, to the bottom of the pyramid, because I think that will be crucial to the economic recovery. And it's important we get cash to them and not just follow this old way of saying, oh, let's provide food, basic food. No, let's give them money so that they can spend the same way the US government is giving money to people who are being unemployed, to those who are sitting at home. They're giving some tax incentives. We should give some holidays in terms of some of these taxes, withholding tax and others. Senegal, for example, the Senegal government is providing 3 months non-payment of electricity and water bills. So they are going to pay for the lower income households. The government is paying for that, for their service. So you don't have to get it out of your pocket. They've also provided some money to the diaspora. Senegal has a huge population of Senegalese living across Europe, the US, and other places. So there are already some examples within Africa of some of the strategies that governments are using. So let's look at what Senegal and Ghana and others are doing. Even in South Africa, for example, they've lifted the ban on informal trading because it was becoming too much. People were not able to survive. But what they've done is they're issuing licenses at the Johannesburg City Council specifically, and they're giving these informal traders a specific time slot in which they can trade on the street. And then they have to make sure they have washing facilities, hand sanitizer, which are being provided. So we need to be, we need to be innovative. We can't just lock down like the way the US and other countries. In fact, even the US right now is debating. States are debating about opening up because you strangle the economy by doing this. And I don't know for how long we can take this, especially in terms of Africa, how long we can manage to lock down large segments of the population.
Thank you, Sumumba, for that broad overview in terms of the situation in Zambia. Of course, it's worrying everywhere, not just in Africa, across the globe, some of the things that we are seeing and how we respond to the situation. From Nissan, what's the situation from your side and what do you see in terms of... Hello, can you hear me, Nissan?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, the question, the latter end of the question.
Oh, the question was was mainly we are looking at the recession. How do you see, when do you see the peak and when do you see this recession coming and when are we likely to recover from the recession, or are we in the recession already? We are moving to depression. What's the reality on the ground and you are from your side?
Definitely. So obviously I'm based in London, but work across the continent. And I think after hearing all the speakers and their inputs, I think it's become evidently clear that you cannot separate the health impact from the economic impact anymore. I think each country, each business, each person has discovered further our fragility, and this is reflected really in the dependence on the rest of the world to satisfy the maintenance of our way of living, and at the same time this isolation and loneliness when attempting to respond to this major exogenous shock is a big impact on the world. So I think in terms of where we are in the recession, I think I would agree with Andrew in saying we already are. It's how much are we going to be in this? How can we support our communities, our countries, our respective businesses and clients to ride this current recession? And I would pretty much share that, going back to what Trevor is saying, we need to obviously inject money into the economy, but we must not forget the difference in power of perhaps the central bank, as well as different economies between, let's say the US or Canada. The government can afford 70 billion in fund to cover this COVID crisis and ride the wave. What are we doing as Africa to do that? And each country has to really help itself. I'd like to, maybe describe in terms of FDI, we've been seeing a lot of implications, and whether they're going to long term is going to be dependent on how this falls through, when the peak. I think we cannot, each country is really trying to understand when that would happen. in terms of our risk assessment in FDI and in terms of the decrease of jobs, we see a major decline in, for example, in tourism, in aviation, in automotive, in oil and gas, as Andrew was mentioning before, in retail and luxury goods, and our whole economy is impacted. When we look at what $1 in FDI has an impact on jobs, it's 2 to 3 times the percentage of return of an investment. And I guess also to look at how the difference would be in these sectors and the impact of these sectors in Africa vis-a-vis other countries. When we look at tourism, for example, the implications of tourism will be very different due to the perception of health systems being ill-equipped in the continent and the already established narrative that may have been skeptical at times. African countries will really have more of a difficult time to catch up and recover in this particular sector. So, when we're looking to, I work day by day with governments and the economic development agencies or the investment promotion agencies. So those tasked with job creation, increasing investment, expanding current business in the country and the current companies that are present in their regions. We're looking at them and we're saying, okay, what are you doing to keep companies at bay? To ensure that your companies are getting the different assistance they needed, and how are you using this time given the different obstacles, such as not being able to interact face to face with your clients in your companies and maintain that relationship and trust. We tell them, okay, how are you engaging online? So to give you an example with Tunisia, we see a lot of their assistance being online. They're having webinars to explain the situation to investors, to have a bit more of to answer any questions. There's empathy discussions, which I will take from Andia, to really secure their clients in this process. And then we also see what I think will be very, very key is the ability to diversify and transform our economies by strengthening the productive capacity of the African private sector and to transform raw materials locally. So, for over and over time, I think we're going to be seeing a big leapfrogging of our economies in a sense of pushing the boundaries of what we've been able to do. We've been over-dependent on imports, over-dependent on aid, which I will get to further. And there needs to be really a pivoting of the strategy from a government side, looking at diversifying its economies, creating the right enabling environment for businesses and the private sector to thrive, and diversifying its sectors that it's focusing on. So, oil dependent, rentier states and so on need to really shift that approach. The growth that we see in FDI is in e-commerce, in educational technology and e-learning, health technology, biotechnology. This is going to be revolutionizing food systems and agriculture thereafter, and obviously the digital world and digital technologies. To give you an example of how, for example, Egypt is responding to this crisis. On one end, it's focusing on labor reforms, on making sure that each Egyptian gets a stipend and coupons to be able to use towards the businesses. So it's not only supporting the people on the ground with giving them the right resources to be able to buy food, to buy their necessary, to pay their rents and so on. It's also enhancing and allowing their industries to really continue operating at that same pace. Another thing they're doing is using this predicament to really focus on the digital transformation and harnessing digital transformation of their economy. So they're putting more stimulus into, for example, if I recall correctly, payment facilitation in terms of debt relief. So a lot of their businesses are supporting this. The mobile wallet, so limits on daily transactions are being increased. Improving merchant acceptance of the landscape by the different payment methods of different providers, and also this automatic enrollment of digital banking. So really seeing an advance in financial inclusion and economic empowerment for for the population. And when you look at Egypt, a country that obviously 70% of the population lives on 6% of the land, you know, the impact of this is, I think it's one of the countries that's most effective in the continent from this pandemic, which the highest rate of infections as well as deaths. So to see them taking a really big charge and responding in an accurate manner is important. I would also go far to say, in terms of where I see this going, is really dependent on how we pivot this crisis. So how are we going to respond? You know, Trevor was mentioning that there needs to be a coordinated effort. I think that's being done to a certain extent. There's regional integration. African governments are focusing on that at a large scale with the African Free Trade Agreement. But other ways is that I think we need to look at Africa where we need to stop being over-reliant on aid. I would say this, that many countries are still continuing to heavily rely on official development assistance. And what we see now is a lot of the original donor countries are shifting. So for example, the US, the UK, and Europe are shifting to domestic reinvestment, redistributing resources towards their economies and the people. So more importantly, the fragility and interdependency of our world is clearer day by day. Not, as you know, you look at not long ago, China and South Korea were aid recipients. And now they're championing assistance missions to Europe, Africa, and MENA regions, you know, sharing expertise, technical expertise, as well as products and goods. So we're really, when we look at Africa, we really need to help ourselves. And we need to stop being reactionary, whether it is in government or in business. The future engagement with the rest of the world must be centered around trade, not aid. And this predicament also provides us with an opportunity to really push the boundaries of African governments, to take this opportunity to scale up policies that spur democracy, create an enabling environment to build prosperity in Africa through really job creation, regional integration, and economic engagement. I think the other panelists have talked about the regional integration and economic engagement. I'll just maybe focus lastly on the job creation. So really increasing the competitiveness of the private sector and will really help our recovery. So whether that is through tax shifts, through stimulation of African economies towards SMEs, governance and transparency, and improvement in the investment climate is important. You know, I looked the other day, I was reading that, and maybe Andia can share a bit because she's back in Kenya, where a factory that was producing gardening clothes, I think it was called the Kitui County Textile Center. This factory transformed in all and out to produce 30,000 surgical masks in a day. And that's huge. In a country that barely produced any before, I see this as an extraordinary effort to shift away from over-reliance on foreign imports and a strong focus on local manufacturing. And this is possible when public, private sector authorities, governments really join together and say, you know what, we can do this. We don't need, you know, a 20-day process to ensure that these regulations are in place. As long as the business is able to operate, it's safe, it's productive. This is how we maintain jobs. This is how we help our own economies. And ultimately, I think Africa needs to help itself. And this over-reliance on others to help us, if we can mitigate that, if we can leapfrog during this time, I think we see ourselves for a strong recovery. Perhaps my view is optimistic, but it's only because I know, as Andia said, of the resilience of our economies, of our people, and the innovative nature of our efforts to respond to moments in history which have impacted our societies, our people, and our economies. So I'll leave it at that, and yeah.
Thank you, Nissan, for that broad view and, of course, highlighting quite key points. In the interest of time, we have a few minutes left. If I go around the panelists and probably ask their final comment and also take there's a few questions. I just trying to compile them in terms of, for the readers and businesses and individuals on the line, in terms of short-term priorities and, of course, long-term planning, what will be the key practical action and guidance would you say they should take to help in the scenario planning? And in terms of the opportunities as we plan the recovery, which industry do you likely to see being affected more, and where do you likely to see opportunities unfolding? Already we are talking about the growth of remote economy in Africa aided by technology. Is this going to be accelerated and as a result of COVID-19, or are we likely to see a shift in what will be the final practical guidance and the recommendation for the audiences to help them navigate the crisis as we go? Andrew, I don't know if we start with you to give a quick brief. And
well, I mean, I think like everywhere else in the world, the crisis is teaching that we can do things in different ways. And I think that the two most obvious places for technological innovation to make a difference in Africa are healthcare and education. And we've talked on this webinar about some of the barriers to that, but I think we're going to end up having to make leapfrogs to deliver that. So it's something we've said here in Nigeria. PwC has said for a long time. I think COVID-19 crisis is going to make us think about that. I think the other thing, though, is one of the things that we found, as I said earlier, is that while the private sector, particularly professional services and FS, are able to kind of work remotely, we found that the government capability is weak. So one of the things we'd like to see coming out of this is the government step up, and I mean, we could use the term e-government, for example, as an imperative. And then, fitting into that, I think one of the things that's very, very obvious when you talk about delivery to the bottom of the pyramid, and just is, I mean, we need to have a refocus, certainly in Nigeria, I'm not sure about the rest of Africa, but on identity and what identity means, because it's very hard to deliver any of these things without some kind of proper identification system, which obviously in the modern world is biometrics and blockchain and all of those things. So I think those three areas, identity, or four areas, identity, e-government, education, and medical care, could really be advanced and leapfrogged if we learn our lessons from this crisis.
Thank you for that brief summary. Simumba, what's your thought on what will be the summary, what will be the key takeaway for the audience to implement now, and what should they look for the opportunities as we recover, as the economy recovers?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson I think that African governments have learned, actually two biggest lessons. The first one is that Africa needs to invest much more in their healthcare systems, their public healthcare systems. I mean, it's a total embarrassment, the level of our healthcare in Africa. So there's need for concerted efforts to increase real financial resources being put into the public healthcare system, in particular also ensuring that our public healthcare workers are properly remunerated and properly trained. Okay, the second major lesson is that Africa needs to trade much more with each other. This nonsense of having only 10, 12% of trade in Africa being intra-Africa, and the rest of our trade is mainly, first of all, primary commodities, oil, copper, gas, agricultural products, primary agricultural products like cotton, coffee, cocoa. We really need to get away from this, and we really need to diversify and empower the local private sector. The incentives we give to foreign investors, local investors don't have it. In any country you go in Africa, there's always a mismatch, okay? Foreign investors will have tax holidays, they will have all sorts of incentives. African entrepreneurs don't get the same incentives, So we really need to ensure that we empower African businesses, and African countries must work together, and we should stop these silos that we're operating in. We need to work together. We need to ensure that there's real collaboration across the borders, and we develop supply chains that will incentivize regional value chains, so that a farmer in Zambia can easily export to a processor in Tanzania or in South Africa or wherever, and from there, a final product is sent to the US, rather than the case that we have today, where, for instance, Zambia, we export 90% of our copper. Very little of our copper is processed in Zambia. And yet, there is so much opportunity in terms of catalytics for the electric cars, you know, there's so much opportunity now in terms of transport and logistics, IT. You know, Africa has actually done much better than the rest of the world when it comes to mobile money, you know, using mobile payment platforms. In fact, in Zambia, the government, as part of the measures under COVID, which I think is an innovation which other countries should look at, increased the total value of transactions you can do on mobile money from 5,000 kwacha to 20,000 kwacha. All right. So immediately, that means that I don't physically have to go to a particular place to make payment. You know, now you have so many booths where people can actually go and obtain cash, and you can send money to any part of the country. And they've also reduced the charges, the fees that relate to online bank transfers, mobile money, or what we call e-wallets, which are, you know, where you have a bank account and then you can you can send money to anyone with a mobile phone, you know, from your bank account. It's an e-wallet. So opportunities will continue to grow in that area, but also in particular opportunities to trade with each other, and also for the big multinationals that are investing in Africa, they need to do more business with local business people. You know, they should give contracts to local suppliers. You know, if it's a matter of skill, lack of skill, help to upscale those skills. You know, provide technical support so that you build robust value chains that even when we have the next crisis, because another crisis will come. It's not like this is the last one we'll ever face. Another crisis will come. We'll be in a better position to deal with it than we've dealt with this particular one. And I think, lastly, countries like China, and in particular China, because China has been a growing influence in Africa, I think China now also needs to change its model of cooperation with Africa. You know, this current model will not work. This crisis has shown very clearly that it's a very tenuous relationship, because there are a lot of projects right now across Africa that are white elephants because the Chinese technical personnel cannot come back into the country until these restrictions are lifted. And so that it's affected a lot of major infrastructure projects. And we've seen it in many countries across Africa. And so this is something I think the Chinese government should think about seriously. And also from our own side as Africa, we need to have a much more robust strategy and approach towards harmonizing our economies and our trade across the borders.
Yeah. Thank you, Sumumba, for that summary. And if we go to Lydia and Nadia, what's your conclusion in terms of key recommendation for global investors or global multinational company operating in Africa? What are the key things they should look for as they trying to navigate the crisis and prepare for recovery before we wrap up? And Lydia, are you listening? Or?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think there's a point we haven't mentioned is the debt management from the government, which is a real concern right now for investors and businesses. Several countries are asking for debt relief, which is quite difficult because the lenders are several. We don't only have the multilateral lenders like the IMF or the World Bank, but we have also a lot of loans coming from China. So I think managing better this debt and the borrowings on both local markets and external market could really improve domestic resources mobilization in the future and reduce the continent dependence on external financial flows.
How about you, Nadia? What's your conclusion in terms of what are the key things that businesses or leaders who are listening at the moment they should consider as to help with the scenario planning and also recovery strategy as we try to navigate the current crisis? And where do you see the opportunity unfolding?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Sorry, who's going?
Or whichever. Okay, Andy will probably start, and then we go to Nadia.
Okay, sorry, I got that. I think we have to remember that, you know, Africa is a very young continent. We have you know, majority of the continent is what I would say under 25. So there are a lot of young people that are dealing with COVID now, not mid-career starting, and I would say that because the future belongs to young people, just make sure that they are completely engaged in some form of decision making. And if the business doesn't have them, now it's a chance to basically reorganize and introduce them, because they're going to be new ways of operating that possibly um, our age group might not be comfortable with, new rules that are written, and we must acknowledge the demographic and the youth of the continent that there is, that's currently existing. We also have to just know from a business perspective, and I want to talk a little bit about the people that have businesses. Um, it's as much as there are opportunities to pivot, because this is a scenario where not only is it a crisis that affects so many sectors all at a go, it also has a personal implication where families have been separated, loved ones have passed away, and because of, you know, I would say how we like to mourn culturally, people are not even allowed to gather. Different things have happened that have created a lot of instability amongst, I would say, individuals. And we have to recognize that our business leaders are individuals. So I'm seeing an increase in coaching, just providing some level of support to, to have people talk through plans. Because what may happen, and I've seen this happen, especially when Kenya went through some terrorist attacks. Some of the businesses that were part of that mall or were within that hotel complex just never started again, just because of demoralization. It is going to be a very difficult time, and there's a lot of support that is required to just help people think about what does actual pivot mean. And going online, I had one of our entrepreneurs that was running a very successful restaurant, but could not translate that into an online takeaway business. It has a different sort of customer preference. So it's almost like you're rewriting the rules of the game, and you're expected to do that in 2 or 3 months. So I think even as financiers, as investors, we have to be very realistic about our current portfolio companies, the level of support that we provide them, but also when we are looking to invest in new, many investors have been putting very high expectations on Africa. Africa, because of the risk, it needs this particular return. Oh, we only go for companies that are sound, that are tested, and you know, all those hurdles just make it a lot more difficult for even the upcoming ones to really have an opportunity to have a chance. So I recommend a review of just even the investment process, not only looking at some of the industries that people point out might maybe be insulated or might able to pivot into the world post-COVID, but also allowing some of the current businesses to navigate their way through this new environment. I think countries are just dealing with this. So it's basically cutting everything slack, because we're not too sure what we're dealing with. But what we do know is that we have the resilience of the African people within us. We also have expertise locally that we've undervalued for a long time. We also have foreign investors that have chosen to invest in expatriates that live in those countries, live in Africa, and we're saying, get to know the locals, get to actually believe what the locals are saying. They don't even have to have gone to the same university that you went to in your country. Let's actually start appreciating a local talent and believing local talent. And I think for us as African citizens, this is the time for African governments and the time for us as private citizens to actually collaborate. The problem is too big for one side to discuss it, to solve it on its own. And to me, just seeing a lot of very, very sort of public-private sector partnerships that can really come to the fore to say, this is how we're going to deliver this solution. And that requires transparency. It requires transparency in the procurement process. In Africa, people that get the tenders, they know somebody. They either, the nephew of somebody or the cousin of somebody. We have to be very transparent about the procurement processes, because there's going to be a lot of opportunities within procurement to provide some services that are there. We also need to look at some of the legislations that we're putting across, that we make sure that this legislation is not keeping people closed. Or preventing people from succeeding. So I'll give you an example. And when I talk about the informal economy that we have to keep alive, we've passed a law in Kenya that if you don't wear a mask, you can get fined up to $200 or 6 months in jail. Guess how many people are going to be going to jail? Because I'll tell you, the price of a mask is more than the transport you usually take to go to work every day. So unless we can say that this is an essential service, can we revisit the pricing of it? And for that, I will also go for the telecommunications companies. This is not the time for them to be talking about how much money they can make, because data is now a utility. What can we do to provide essential services at the lowest cost to the widest people, but you still make a profit? And I think everybody has to adjust. So we need government to think more like private. We need private to think more like government until we get out of this. And ultimately, it's not to think that, oh my God, I remember seeing this headline, Olympics canceled because COVID has come to Africa. And I said, why? It was all over Africa. It was the last. And even now, our cases are the fewest in the world. But everybody dooms, it's in Africa. What's going on? I don't think that level of pessimism. So the art of storytelling, what is told about Africa, the positive stories that, I just saw, was it Nadia that mentioned, that talked about the textiles, those stories, and they don't only have to come out of Washington Post, New York Times, read the local paper, see what's in there, join the social networks that we have there. And those stories must be put on the platforms, because stories bring confidence. And what we want is people to not use COVID as an extra excuse to not invest in the continent, but they invest elsewhere. Yeah. If there's going to be low investment, let it be across the board.
Yeah, thank you, Andia, for that brief, and also highlighting, of course, some additional point. Quickly for Nadia and Nissan, 1 minute each. Unfortunately, we've passed the time, and if you just give one minute summary, Nadia and Nissan, in terms of your key point, and then.
Okay, so I'll start. So yes, if I have 1 minute, I would just say like some buzzwords, but it's really all about collaboration and solidarity between private and public sector, between the private sector and different industries and different countries, also implicating or involving, the civil society organizations, which are very, very powerful across our continent. Then as well, always it is related to transparency and communication. So indeed, as Andia was just saying, I fully agree. There are so many success stories, so many innovations and things happening in all the countries in Africa, but it's just once in a while you see something somewhere, but really, again, it's also linked to collaboration and really like best practices and lessons learned. And last but not least, to take also this crisis actually somehow as an opportunity for Africa to, let's say, to rise again, and to really put also in terms of policies, but also approaches in the private sector and elsewhere, actually we are forced now to change and adapt very rapidly. And you see Africa does that and will do it. And it's really, we have to continue on that, because As I think Nissan was saying earlier, aid, yes, can help, but it's also not really helping a lot of African countries. So now Africa has really to think about how to really do it and act, and not only about talking and getting help by others, but really taking this opportunity, let's say, to really make the change themselves or ourselves.
Thank you, Nadia. And finally, Nissan, what's your 1 minute summary conclusion in terms of what businesses and individuals should look for, or key practical takeaway from this discussion to help them navigate the current situation as they look for the future?
Sure. So I'll do this a bit quite quickly, but let me focus on, some general statements first. Is when it comes to matters of health, so if anyone is in this call in the medical industry or a business or working perhaps in an industry and looking to diversify, do whatever it takes to protect people's lives, medical professionals, and the extremely fragile state of major health systems across the continent. Anything you do, if it adds value to the situation, will be critical. It's also very important to make sure that people who are losing jobs are able to survive, to take care of their health. Basic services have to be provided, because without our people, we are nothing. So basic services needs to be subsidized or provided. If you are in a position to do so, then I think companies should be shifting their approach. It's more of a long-term strategy. And then really, I will speak to a little bit, because I don't think we touched on it, is that SME have the resources they need so they can stay alive. So once we pass this phase, sooner or later, we'll still have these business somewhat intact. To speak to the business community, some few things that I've been speaking to different experts from different fields is conserve your cash, make sure you talk to your customers, you cannot visit them, but speak to them and look at how they're affecting their businesses, and have that proximity to understand how you need to pivot. So not only what are the new industries you should be shifting at, but how you can do that as your business. I've seen companies that's obviously worked in consulting and technology, such as myself, and we're shifting towards technology and R&D at this moment in time. So really being flexible, and then obviously communicate as much as possible. Draft a statement to your businesses and send it to your customers, your suppliers, and your stakeholders, and get ahead of the curve and communicate up front. So you don't want uncertainty, doubt, and panic, as much as already is happening, to manifest in your customers or staff. So communication is key, and perhaps through that you come up with solutions that are actually long-term. And I see on this conversation, I've seen a few of people who I actually work with and have discussed with in the investment promotion authorities and the governments. And what I would say is it's really time to power up and not down. So, focus on this time towards domestic reinvestment and aftercare. Every business, every country knows that it's easier to retain business than it is to accelerate new business. So in the meantime, reach out to your current investors, change your aftercare strategy, nurture those investment opportunities, and build trust in the long term. Another thing I would say is train and upskill your staff. And obviously, if you're in a position of policy and advocacy, I would say that, look at this time as changing your strategy to target high potential markets and not be over dependent on one major source. Such as, for example, in Africa, we've currently been quite dependent on one major sources, such as China and the US, and really need to diversify to those, and in tandem, adapt your target sectors to global market conditions and outlooks, so new growth sectors, which I had mentioned before. Again, communicate to your clients, to your businesses, and most importantly, take care of yourself and your health.
Yeah.
So that's my last remarks, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We've even gone beyond, but the discussion was thought-provoking and, of course, insightful. Quite a lot of key points highlighted, and the commendation and the concern raised, and quite a lot of things to look for. in the coming weeks. We'll continue to host this kind of discussion weekly, engaging all the stakeholders across the region and the industry, hopefully to help to give or bring clarity in terms of how the situation is evolving and to help businesses to navigate and respond effectively. Thank you so much for our speakers for spending their time and joining us and sharing their perspective. And we look forward to having you again, and have a good afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a good.